Good evening. My name is Margery Gans, and I'm a member of the board of the Writers' Room of Boston. I am delighted that you could join us this evening for the it's not October, for the February 2026 interview in our virtual series, Writers' Room After Hours. This series began in 2023. We have other series that have gone on longer and other things that I will talk about in a minute at the room. But for anyone new to us, the Writers' Room of Boston is a co working space in downtown Boston for any and all writers, both those just starting and those who've been writing for a while and maybe had some good success so far. Anybody who wants to be able to have peace and quiet while they write, but also anybody who wants to find a community of writers. That is something that we've really been concentrating on since the pandemic because during the pandemic, the community absolutely had to disperse, but we are coming back. So please consider us if you, again, want a quiet place to write and also a place to meet and talk with other writers. We've been serving writers of the greater Boston area since 1993. And since the pandemic, as I said, the room has particularly been offering online resources, including this interview series, monthly readings from the room, which is also a chance for readers to read, and online writing groups with prompts and discussions. We also have in-room groups that meet both to write, but also with a chance to talk about writing and socialize with writers at the same time. This interview series, which began in 2023, gives us a chance to talk more in depth with writers and also people just associated with writers. So we might have agents, we might have publishers, we've had people who do audiobooks, and we also want to talk to different writers who write in different styles, different genres. So we're looking to expand and we want to speak to people with a wide range of expertise. So sometimes, if you'd like to know any more about us, please, you can look at our website. You can also look on our Facebook and Instagram page. There will be both announcements for upcoming activities and also just a description of the room itself. We would love to have new members, and we have different levels of membership. So we have a virtual membership, we have a weekend membership, and we will not turn anyone away who is interested and committed to writing because of not being able to play. So please consider us. If you're interested, check out the website, which is writersroomofboston.org. This series is made possible by grants from the Mass Cultural Council, the Boston Cultural Council, and we also rely on friends. If you enjoy this program, please consider making a contribution using the donate button on the website. Also, we will be recording this interview, and a replay will be available on the website. So tonight, I am speaking with Amy Shea, and I just got a notice that the website is on the chat, so you can check it out. So Amy is the author of Too Poor to Die, The Hidden Realities of Dying in the Margins. It's Rutgers Press, 2025. She is the writing program director at Mount Tamalpais College, a college for incarcerated people in San Quentin, California. Her essays have appeared in the Missouri Review, Portland Review, Massachusetts Review, and Sociology of Health and Illness, as well as others. We welcome Amy tonight, and you can come back on the screen. And Amy and I have talked a little, she's in California, and we've talked a little about some interests that we share. And so I'm going to be asking her tonight both about herself as a writer and also a little bit about this subject that she's chosen to write about. Um, so, first off, can you just tell us a little about yourself as a writer?
Yeah. Oh boy. Yeah, that's an interesting question. As a writer, I mean, I consider myself an essayist primarily, although I have this dream of writing some mystery novels at some point. So
That's great.
we'll see if I get to that. I've considered I've been writing for so long, since I was a kid. But I went kind of, graduated from college. I went and worked for a while, and then in my 30s, I went back to grad school and got an MFA in creative writing. Took a couple of years in between, and then went back and got a doctorate in creative writing, where I
Oh,
wrote this book, or the draft of it. So it's been nice to kind of really embody that kind of being a writer. And when I was in Boston, I was part of Grub Street. I went there all the time. I was obviously a member of the writers' room. I tell people, it's one of those things. I don't do it for fun. I do it because I feel like I have to.
yeah.
And often I've gotten questions about this book and the work I do in the prison. How, how do I deal with like such difficult subjects and sort of, maintain any kind of sanity and kind of
Hmm.
protect my own mental health. And I say I do it through the writing.
Yeah.
That's how I process. And so, yeah, it's a big part of who I am and what I do.
Hmm. And you mentioned being an essayist, and in your book, Too Poor to Die, the one you just came out in 2025, you you do something really interesting to me, which is you talk in the introduction about the essay as a form. And a lot of people write essays and they put out books of essays, but they don't necessarily talk about it as a form. So, could you talk for maybe people in the audience or anybody thinking, tell us what you thought about essays, why you chose that? I mean, you could have chosen other genres, but your sort of commitment to the essay. Could you talk about that, please?
Yeah, I mean, part of it, the sh very short, easy answer in some ways was that that's what I'd been doing, that I've been writing in the essay form for so long that when it came to write this, it just felt like the natural thing for me to do. But I think primarily too, there were other bigger reasons why I chose the essay form. One being that in some ways it can be anything. And
Mm-hmm.
so I could really push and play within that form and within that genre. So, I have all kinds of different structures. Each chapter, I was the structure was chosen for me. I chose it based on what I thought was going to get that message across for that particular chapter, whether it was Sweet Feet, where I'm talking about volunteering at the foot care clinic in Boston, or where I talk about death positivity and I break that down and kind of, in how I wanted to approach that. As I just felt like the essay just allowed me to really be very very mobile in how I wanted and being able to just do whatever I wanted within that space to get that message across. I think also for me, because I was dealing with this topic that is quite difficult and is to me very important, I felt in order to do a service to the people who experience homelessness and find themselves coming to the end of their lives while they're homeless, plus the people doing work in that space, uh, it felt really important to me to share the true stories that and the voices that came from that. Not that you can't do that with fiction, but I wanted, people to know these people as the individuals they actually were, and the organizations and the places that step in and do a lot of good work in these spaces where there's these huge gaps. So I think for me, all of that was really important to be done in that nonfiction, factual manner.
So a lot of it was that sort of depth and breadth that you could move around in. And
Right.
one of the things you also, I think, talk about in that essay is that it gave you a chance to be involved personally. So you used yourself. It wasn't an essay sort of out there. Say
Right.
more
Because
about how you decided and how you decided to use yourself. Were there times you thought, uh-oh, too much, and then revised it?
yeah, I mean, that was a really interesting decision that I had to live with because, and I think for me, yes, it was useful because, like I say in the book and the intro, I could be vulnerable on the page. I could ask questions, and through those questions and through that vulnerability, the reader can see into a space that they may not be familiar with. I joke in some ways that this book was a quest narrative, and it was me on this
Mhm.
quest to learn things. And so by doing it in that personal essay form, I could take the reader with me on that journey because some of the story in there is how hidden some of these things are, how difficult this information was to come by. And if I just done, say, like narrative journalism, that might not have come across on the page, right? It would have maybe been me standing a little further apart from the
Mhm.
topic. Um, but yeah, it was, I talked about this in the chapter called Assaying on the anxiety of positionality. Uh, at times, it almost stonewalled me completely or stopped me from doing the work because I was so afraid of doing harm because I was a white, housed woman coming into this space and talking about people who aren't so necessarily housed and who aren't necessarily white and who don't have a safe space to live and be. And I had to really reckon with who was I to tell these stories and who was I to get into this topic. And I go into that in some serious
Yeah.
depth. But I also did feel ultimately that, again, I was a vehicle for a lot of people like myself who may not know what it's like to be living on the streets or and having a terminal illness while you're unhoused or not being able to afford a funeral for your loved ones, those types of things. And so ultimately, and I talk about this in the book too, I came to the conclusion after a lot of wrangling, and I figured this out by looking to other writers, looking to other artists, and trying to understand how they were approaching it. And I did finally come to understand that as a writer, no matter how small my platform was, I felt an obligation to speak out on the things I cared about. And this was something I felt very passionately about, and even though I hadn't personally experienced it, didn't mean I didn't want to speak up. And it didn't mean that I necessarily was, taking space away from someone else to speak, but that I wanted to show this through my voice. And I think hopefully also that brings an intimacy to the work that may be doing something that's more, I think it is journalistic in a lot of ways, but that creative nonfiction, that narrative nonfiction aspect allows it to be a little bit more personal in nature.
And I mean, I felt reading it also white, middle class, educated, all that stuff, that by your talking about that, and I'm going to ask you a little more about that, that you were sort of offering, like you were kind of holding out your hand to me,
Mhm.
as an audience saying, come with me here. This is going to be a little difficult and it's going to be another world from the one you inhabit. But, I've sort of been there. I've learned the language as best I can.
Mhm.
And so at least I can do that much
Yeah.
and better than doing nothing and leaving us both on this other shore, essentially.
Yeah.
Um, when you said you worried about doing harm,
Mhm.
what kind of harm did you worry about?
It's funny when I first, like in the first year of the doctor, and I started to go, okay, I need to do research, and did a lot of sort of textual, based research, right? Reading a lot of scholarly journal articles and books and everything else. But I knew that ultimately what I needed to do was be on the ground, so to speak, right? I needed to be talking to people. I needed to hear stories, and doing that underneath the university meant I had to go through ethics review.
Hmm.
And it stuck with me. And one of the things I can't remember if this was in the document or if this was something somebody said in an email or to me, but they said no matter how good your intentions are, you can still do harm as a researcher. And that I think it was just sort of a blanket statement, not for the work that I was specifically doing, but any researcher going into any topic and dealing with individuals, with people and particularly going into a space with potentially vulnerable individuals. And I wrestle with this in the book as well. I thought there were times when I would go and interview people and I would think I really had to start to ask myself why I was there, what I was wanting from them. and what I was getting out of it. And it's actually something we talk about a lot when I teach in the prison and when we talk to our volunteers who come in, and ask yourself and reflect constantly when you're doing work in these spaces, why are you doing it? And what are you getting out of it? And it's not to say that it's bad that you do get something out of it, but to be really reflective of that. And so I could talk when I go in the book about going to interview this man, Richard, in Phoenix, and in my mind, thinking like, oh, I'm gonna have this like this bond with this guy. I'm gonna go and I'm gonna talk to him, and I'm thinking, what are you trying to get? Like, are you
Hmm.
wanting like this, to when you're taking this person's time, what is it you're taking from them at that same time? Especially when I was talking to people who were on hospice, and all I could think was, I'm taking up precious moments.
Hmm.
Um, and is that okay? And are they okay with that? And then also, there were a lot of questions around not wanting people to feel obligated to have to speak to me.
Hmm.
So part of often what I did was I would go through organizations. I didn't go directly onto the streets because one, I couldn't do that through ethics, and also there's a lot potentially wrong with just approaching someone on the street and saying, "Hey, I
Yeah.
wanna," But going through organizations and sort of having them vet me and allow me to come in. So when I spoke to Richard at Circle the City, which was a medical respite in Phoenix, they had spoken and with him, and he was happy to talk to me. And in the back of my mind, I had to think, or I worried that he was saying yes to them to please them because he cared
Hmm.
about the staff there, right? They had become like family to him. And so I really want to make sure that people felt like they were doing this because they wanted to and not because they felt some kind of obligation to speak to me.
Hmm.
So those were the types of things. And also just in representing somebody who's having an experience that I've not had, that I am doing that as clearly and transparently and factually as possible so that I'm not misrepresenting something that they're going through or
Hmm.
pretending like I can fully understand it. Like, yes, I can understand it in the same way someone who hasn't experienced that comes to my book and can understand it.
Yeah.
But it's different having lived that, of course. And so I always
Hmm.
want to be mindful of those types of questions,
Right.
those things.
I mean, it's interesting because one of the things I thought when I was in graduate school, which is way back, in the 80s, one of the women who was in the program with me was doing work on sort of geriatric psychology. And she talked about how much people wanted when they were in hospice, and at that, there wasn't as much hospice then, but sort of at the end of life, whatever setting they were in, they wanted so much. And I to talk about their
Mhm.
lives like they'd lived, whether it was 60, 70, 80, 90, 100 years. Did you find that at all, that your coming in actually was partly a gift to them?
Yeah, I think at times for sure. Again, with Richard, and that was one of the things when I first started out doing research, I thought, okay, I'm going to ask all these questions about kind of more of the medical aspect of things or what it's like, being on hospice in a medical respite unit or a hospice that's for in-house people and what led you there and whatnot. And we talked about that some, but what I found in talking to him and other people is that he really also just wanted to share his life. Like I felt like, there were times where you're having a life review with folks. And he talked about the joys of that he enjoyed sewing and they had found him a sewing
Mhm.
machine, talked about his daughter, about his family, about his mom growing up. And I had others, I spoke to a man at another hospice in Salt Lake City, and he talked about, he had come on to hospice fairly recently, hadn't been homeless prior to that, but ended up not unable to stay at home, and so was and had to go there because he had become over the course of his life estranged from his family, from his two sons after he'd gotten divorced. But he was so excited to talk about the fact that since he'd been there, he'd reconnected with his sons and that they were
Mhm.
trying to get up to see him before he died. And his friend was there and he was, talked about the friendship. And so it was, yeah, oftentimes I learned really open with like a very broad kind of open-ended question and just let people talk. I think I worried a lot about like having to have like, sort of interview questions lined up or something.
Mhm.
And yeah, oftentimes that wasn't the case, and that's for folks both on hospice, but also people who were just in these spaces on medical respite, which means they were
Mhm.
going to recover and they would eventually leave. they also often just wanted to talk about, what was happening in their lives. And there,
Mhm.
when I was at the in-between in Salt Lake City, there was actually a volunteer there who was doing really lovely work. He would come in, people would agree to talk with him, and they would go through their whole life history with him, and he would transcribe it all and then give it to them as like kind of like their memoirs or something, right? So that they could have
Oh,
all of that in writing. He would record it all while he spoke with them, ask them questions, and then would type it all up. And so that was, yeah, it was really cool to see that.
that's fantastic.
Mhm.
Yeah. So I'm going to go back to the writing aspect
Mhm.
because you talked about watching a documentary that was really important to you. And you mentioned that I'm looking to see if I have the exact quote, but I'm not sure that I do. Oh, yes. You mentioned that it's the choice and the placement of detail. And I can only imagine the amount of information that you went through. I'm going to ask you a little about your research in a bit,
Mhm.
but how, I'm having about five thoughts at once. You know, I- how did you decide what details to use and where to place them?
Very painfully. Um, uh, yeah, it's really funny, gosh, so much information. And I don't have brevity when it comes to my writing. And uh, I actually, and I'll talk really quick. Like before I even realized I was writing a book, I had started researching sort of broadly, like death and dying and attitudes towards death and dying. And I wrote this, I don't know, God, it must have been 20 to 30 pages. And I don't know how I got away with this, but I took it to a Grub Street class, and someone was like, "This is really interesting, but it's not an essay, it's a book." And so that was kind of the initial trajectory. So then when I went in to start the doctorate, it was at the University of Glasgow in the UK. And they are very strict about how much time you can take. You get 3 years and you get a fourth year if you really, really need it, but you're expected to be up and out. So I went in there going, okay, I'm like, I have to write all this stuff. And I think I came to my doctoral supervisors within the first week with a huge table of contents and said, here's my plan. And they just laughed at me. They were like, no, like delete that, ignore that, just go play. And so, I'm gathering all this research, I'm doing all these things. And I tell students this when I'm talking about, right, I talk about this a lot of times, especially when I'm talking about writing research type, stuff. Um, I wrote the first draft within the first year of being a doctorate. And I took it to my creative writing supervisor. I had one who was a writer, one who was an anthropologist. So I took it to the writer, and she reviewed it, and she came back to me and she was like, "You're not gonna want to hear this." She's like, "But start from scratch. Delete, ignore all of this, start over."
Oh my
She's like, "You
goodness.
have it all there." She's like, "You don't need to look at, just start over. Keep all that information's great." And one of those chapters in there was the one that's now called Deaths of Disparity. It's the second to last kind of full chapter. And it started out as an essay called Living and Dying like with homelessness on A to Z or something like that. And I had done this in a collage style essay where I had just gone through and alphabetically hit all these different kind of medical issues, injuries, different things that physically can happen to people as they live on the streets. And I would like give a definition and, have a story. And I did this whole huge collage essay. And for people who go and then read the book and see that Deaths of Disparity chapter is very different from that.
Uh-huh.
And so, yeah, I mean, I literally was just writing, writing, writing. And then I did the whole, what I call Frankenstein. There was just constantly like, moving things around. The story that actually opens that chapter with the man who overdoses in the Dunkin' Donuts down in Boston, that scene must have been in like five different chapters at least before I
Uh-huh.
settled on that one. So it was a constant like moving around of pieces, ideas, stories, research, and then moving the chapters around. It was like the hardest puzzle ever. But um I am happy with how it came out, but man, that was tough.
Well, in some ways, it's encouraging. I mean, because it's just hard work. You
It
know,
is.
if you're doing something that's that ambitious, the fact that you have to redo it and redo it. I'm curious, though, when that advisor came to you and said, "You're not going to want to hear this." Why was she saying that? What did she have that she needed you to redo?
Because I think at that point I was mostly I hadn't done a whole lot of field work research yet. That was still to come. And so it was just too soon. And what I had done was I had read I read and watched and listened to freaking everything under the sun that I could possibly get my hands on. And I was trying to kitchen sink it all in there.
I see.
And I was it I don't think at that point I still had a clear vision of exactly what it was I was trying to say or how I wanted to say it. I just knew I had so much and I could see all these different connections and I was excited by all of it. And it was just a big tangled mess of mostly me just processing the research
I see.
versus
Yeah.
it being really compelling narrative.
Yeah. I mean,
Anyway.
in a way, it sounds like it was almost that was the one you wrote for you. And and then
And And it was really like I think I had to do it because I had such anxiety. I was saving. I would type up notes from any article or any book or anything I read. I would type them up into a separate document. And so I think my notes page like ended up being almost 300 pages just because and I had so much anxiety about how I was going to do any of that service and what needed to go in there and what didn't, that I
right.
just was like, I was frantically trying to get that done after that first year so that I could show something and be like, this is what I've done. And
Yeah.
she's like, yeah, you're not there yet. It's not
Yeah.
ready.
So what so you hadn't done the sort of research on the streets yet when you wrote that?
That first draft, no. And it's funny because I tell students who are doing even just research papers, so don't wait to write until you've finished your research. Because part of it was I think I needed to write into it to start to think about what was I missing. I knew I needed the voices. I knew I
Mm-hmm.
needed people, but what specifically was it? And doing that research helped lead me to people. It was
Mm-hmm.
all there was nothing straightforward about any of it. It was very kind of organically happening. So
Yeah.
as I would read something, I go, oh, the Compassionate Care Coalition of California. Ooh, I got to contact them. While I'm reading an
Mm-hmm.
article they wrote, I'm also contacting them about this nurse down in Santa Monica that I can talk to. And so, yeah, I didn't wait to do that because again, I partly wanted to have, I knew I was going to weave in that textual research as well, but part of it was like starting to parse that out and just yeah, figure it out and figure out where I was going. It was yeah,
Mm-hmm.
'cause there was no roadmap.
Well, I was going to say, it sounds, I mean, actually, my mind sort of works like it's all over the map.
Yeah.
And it sort of sounds like each thing that you did kind of opened something up. And then that might send you back to writing, which might send you then to an organization, which might send you then to another, which might send you back to writing. But that it really was, as you said, sort of organic and
Hmm.
probably wouldn't have worked as well if you had tried to go from A to B to C and beyond, that you had to
No,
go from A to M to oranges to,
exactly. And it was like I would talk to one person and they would say, you need to talk to these three people. And then that part
Mhm.
and my poor anthropology supervisor, because I would bring drafts of stuff to her and she was like, you don't like outlines, do you? I was like, no. I said, do the outline after I've written multiple drafts because
Yep.
then I can, as I revise, then I start to see the through line and then I
Hmm.
start to see what it is I'm trying to get at. And then I know what needs to go and I know where I'm going. But it usually takes me writing into it to figure it out.
So I'm curious because outlining is one of those things. It seems to me often people are like, yes, all the time, I love it, or oh my God, never. And it sounds like somehow you managed to give it a hybrid. But so did you end up outlining it? Just say,
Um, yeah, it's because. I am a pantser by nature versus a planner. I can't help it. I really
Mhm,
want to be a planner because everything is so tangled up in here. It's the only way I
mhm.
manage to, keep anything straight. But yeah, so what I kind of did was I was a lot of time just writing into things and oh, that's a connection. Oh, that's interesting. And just like playing. And then as I would go through it, I would start to see like, oh, this story's not working this way. And I would literally break it out into paragraphs that with white space so that I could print
Mhm.
it, cut it out, label them A, B, C, whatever, and then put it on the floor and start moving it around, like
Yep.
literally physically. And that was how, and then as I would do that, I would then draft the outline. I go, okay, that's A. And then
Mhm.
sometimes I know, okay, I don't have C. Here's what I want to put in there. And that was how I could start
Ah,
to see
yeah.
things that I needed to like connect different ideas. And of course, like the biggest thing missing early on were the stories. And so I
Mhm.
knew that I was like, but I didn't I didn't know what I was going to get for stories. So I kind of had to start thinking about that. And then as those stories came, then I had to go back and do that all over again.
Mhm.
Yeah.
A while back, you used the word message.
Hmm.
And I know that, I mean, that was sort of in part what you were talking about when you were talking about, do I have a right to do this?
Mhm.
Did you articulate your message to yourself? And if so, or if not even, how did that help you organize this mountain of material and pick those details and put them in a certain place?
Yeah, so the original title of the book, I had there's a little section at the end of there's a poem at the end. It's in the form of an index, and there's a line there.
Mm,
And it was not all, so death is the great equalizer, but not all deaths are created equal.
hmm.
And I printed that out like in a big old piece of paper like this big. And wherever I would like I had like an office for a while, I would post that up. I would keep that with me everywhere I went. And that was the thing in my
Mm.
mind. And it's like, I mean, that was my thesis statement, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
that was the crux of what I was trying to write. And so that event, and, just kind of keeping that in front of me. And I can't say that there was this real like tangible sense of, yes, that fits in with that. But it was just knowing that
Mhm.
constantly in the back of my mind as I was working, that that was what I was trying to get across.
Uh-huh.
And so I literally kept that where I could see it. And for a long time, I said that was the title. Because it just was the driving force for what got included and what didn't. And yeah.
I mean, you said that you really started out, your questions were about death.
Hmm.
Can you say what got you interested in death as something to write about?
Yeah, it's not a straightforward story. Of course not. Why would it be?
But we all come to these things. We all come to these things because there's something that intrigued us
Mhm.
or worried us or made us angry or a million different, but it all starts with us. That's kind of what
Absolutely.
being a writer is. So just if you don't mind talking about it,
Yeah,
but
of
I know
course.
some of it's
No.
in your book, so that's why I
Yeah.
asked.
Two of the biggest things was, well, first was my dad was doing work in my hometown of Fresno, California, for the genealogy society there, and he was mapping all the cemeteries in the city. And when I say mapping, he was doing that for the library, so that if somebody came to the library looking for like great great grandpa or something, they
Hmm.
could say, "Oh, he's at Holy Cross Cemetery, and this is
Oh,
where the location." And in doing that, he came in contact with the county coroner. I don't know if they contacted him or how, if someone heard what he was doing, but they said, "Hey, we've got these stack of boxes that are all the records from all the people buried in the county cemetery." And for folks who don't know, county cemeteries, if you've heard the term Potter's Field, is another term.
yeah.
They're county or public disposition programs, which, so if someone dies and doesn't have the means to pay for their own, to be paid, pay for burial or cremation, if their families don't have it, in general in the United States, it's the county that takes over. In Massachusetts, it's actually a state-run thing. It's like statewide. It's very disparate across the country in how it's done. But basically, people who are buried in those places are people who couldn't afford private burial or
Yeah.
cremation. And he took, so he was talking about this, and I was living in Boston, and I would come home for a visit. And I went with him to see the county cemetery because I think he must have described it, and I thought, what the heck is a potter's field? I've never even heard of this. And I was in my late 20s at that point, and I wasn't thinking a whole lot about death, and I certainly wasn't thinking about how much it costs to be dead.
Mhm.
And and so we
Yeah.
go to the Catholic cemetery where some of my family was buried, and we walk to the back of it, and there's a chain link fence, and on the other side is the county cemetery. It was so hidden, so like we didn't actually at that point he wasn't even sure if he could get inside. It didn't look like a place you were allowed to go. And I write about this in the book, but it was a dirt field with these huge weeds sticking up in various places. And you had to look closely, but you could see the scores of cement strips through,
Yeah.
and there were, and you couldn't see from where we were, but there were numbers etched in, and those were the plots.
Hmm.
And man, that haunted me. That really struck me. We're in Fresno, California, which is this weird place of being both desert and like the breadbasket of the country. And on one side of the fence with the Catholic cemetery, where it's like lush green grass because they're watering it constantly and it's very beautiful and trees and blah, blah, blah. And then on the other side is this dirt lot that you wouldn't have no idea that that was a place of burial. So that was the first thing, and that made me, that angered me. That really upset me. I was just volunteering with homeless, organizations, knowing that not everyone who ends up in a Parsfield field is homeless, and not everyone who's homeless ends up in a Parsfield field, but knowing that that was a possibility, and knowing that people who were buried there weren't really being given sort of the same dignity or like, and their loved ones weren't being given the same space to go mourn, right, or to visit.
Right.
And then it was another 2 years later, my grandmother died as I was starting the MFA, also at the University of Glasgow. And while I was there, I was writing a doctoral, sorry, a master's thesis. It was creative nonfiction, again, mostly vignettes and essays. And I wrote about visiting that county cemetery. And I wrote a lot about my grandmother dying. And I didn't even understand I was really fully doing it until it was a
Ah,
collection of essays that I was like are on memory and identity and place. And people would read it and go, oh, it's really good. There's this really dark undertone to it. Well, that dark undertone was me grappling with mortality
yeah.
and thinking about when my grandmother died, how our family dealt with that collectively and individually, what we were able to do versus what other people aren't able to do, and all these things were swirling around my head. And so that's how I kind of really got into this topic of death and dying. Again, it was sort of by accident. I didn't know I was doing it. And I came
Yeah.
back to Boston after I'd done the master's program a couple of years later. And I just started reading and writing or reading and watching everything death and dying and found myself in death positivity, which is a social
Mhm.
movement that advocates for talking about death and being prepared for death. And it was all very weirdly exciting, I think, because I finally had this place to
Hmm.
like I've been doing all this thinking and reflecting, and suddenly there were other people you could do this thinking and reflecting with.
Yeah.
But it was starting to come up as at that time. That was like 2015 or so. And I was starting to notice again all the people having these conversations were all very middle class, we're all very white, mostly women. And we're talking about all these things. Do you want hospice? Do you want death doula? What do you think about green burial? Blah, blah, blah. And you're like, that's all really well and good. But then I go to Rosie's place and I volunteer. And what
Uh-huh.
about the people who are there who end up dying on the streets? They're not having these conversations. They can't
Mhm.
afford, hospice necessarily or death doula or like, they're not doing DNRs and advanced directives. Um, and he's kind of like, again, it was like that anger coming together with that
Yeah.
reflected. I was hearkening back to going to that county cemetery. And my doctoral supervisor had taught me in my master's program. And when I was doing the master's, she had said something that stuck with me. And that was right where the heat is. And
Hmm.
for me, I was like, I keep coming back to that stupid cemetery. I
Yeah.
can't leave it alone.
Yep.
And I can't leave this idea alone of what happens, and thinking about death and dying and thinking about what happens for people who can afford and versus who can't. And circle, circle, circle. And I was like,
Yeah.
oh, going back and yeah, went
Yeah.
back and did the doctorate. So that was kind of how I got into it. It was sort of a couple of things, I guess, or a few things.
And you had already been working with homeless people.
Yeah, I've
And
been
you've been at
working in
Rosie's place.
shelters at Rosie's place and yeah, which I was teaching there and doing other stuff there and
How,
then
how, how did you get started with that?
I'd
How
always
did,
volunteered like since high
yeah.
school, and it was always like, what's something that I can do? And I remember coming back and thinking, again, it's like, what skills do I have? What am
Hmm.
I, how can I be useful? And I could go there and teach writing and creative writing in English and things like that. Um, and yeah, I loved it. And then when I went to go do research for the book, I was like, I want to volunteer somewhere.
Hmm.
Um, and I volunteered at the foot care clinic. I really wanted to do something where I could like be actively involved in someone's care.
Yeah.
And so that was also amazing. So
Hmm.
yeah,
I mean, I think what you're saying in so many ways that's so important is that you, I mean, one of the wonderful things about being a writer is you can anything that excites you, anything that sort of arouses that passion and that interest, and you could write about it.
yeah,
I mean, as you said,
absolutely.
it was sort of a way, it's a way that you could manage. I mean, what some of what we overlap is that, I've worked in prisons and, it can get grim.
Yeah,
And it's grim and it's also fascinating and you're learning and that's where you sort of get into, is this for me or for them or what,
yeah.
although my job was very different from yours, but but you write and it is a way of kind of opening it up to let it breathe, and
Hmm.
you can sort of manage it because and then it's not even just you alone with
Right.
this topic. I mean, even if nobody reads it, but if you really hope that somebody reads it and you want to write a book, then you're going to find some community, which is what it sounds like you found
Oh
when
my
you came
gosh,
back
it's
here.
it's funny because people will be like, God, that's such a dark topic. And I'm like, it's funny. It's like I don't think about it that way because I'm constantly engaging with
Hmm.
so many amazing people. And I took it to an agent before I found Rutgers, and he did me and he said, he had read the manuscript or like whatever part of it, and he said, homelessness and dying. So both of those are real bummers. No one's gonna want to read about that. And I'm like, cool, thanks. So useful. And I always say, I'm like, but it's in so many ways such the opposite. Just 2 weeks ago, I was down in Fresno giving a talk at the college. I got to go back to my like I started at community college. I got to go back there and talk. I met people who work for the social justice center. They're amazing. While I was there, I went and met with a young woman who's a mortician down there and had worked with and we had this amazing interview and conversation, and then I found another woman who'd come up from LA to talk to me, and every time I talk to people about this book, I meet more people who next thing I know is like, oh, let's collaborate or let's do this or like,
Yeah.
and I go to these places and I interview staff and caregivers and residents and patients, and there's so much joy that it's sometimes you forget. You're like, okay, I'm dealing with this really like kind of grim topic,
Right.
and yet my even my supervisor, my doctoral supervisor, and I would laugh because should we be sitting in her office cackling? Like we
Yes.
would just be like, oh my God, and this and that, and we're talking about death. And she's like, people must walk by and be thinking, what the heck is wrong
Hmm.
with them? But it's the connection, and I think that is ultimately for me in writing it, and then having people read it. And having it out there in the world, I've met so many more people who are doing amazing work. And so, yeah, it's absolutely that community aspect.
And I think that's just going back to what we were talking about really wrestling with, why am I doing this? Could I be perpetrating harm? How you decided to do it is, to me, the best. It's like you've invited us all into a world, and it's a human world. I mean, it's unlikely that I will ever be homeless or have a close friend who's homeless. I doubt that. And yet, I mean, it's the same with working in a prison. It's a world, and
Yeah,
it's a world full of human beings.
absolutely.
And they're going to die, and
Mhm,
we're going to die, and we're going to die differently,
mhm,
given the structure of the culture and society and capitalism and all that. But it is a human world.
mhm.
And that alone sort of makes it interesting to venture into especially if it's foreign to you. So,
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. For sure.
The I'm just gonna, this is a question that's just, it's bouncing off, so I'm gonna ask.
Mhm.
How did you end up going to Glasgow for your MFA?
Yeah, that was random too. Um, for being someone who's very like likes to plan, I do a lot of random things. Um, I had studied abroad in London way, way back when I was an undergrad. And after I came back, I was in California and I said, I'm gonna go somewhere different for the rest of my college. I'm gonna transfer, and that's how I ended up in Boston. I was like, I want to go somewhere where I don't know anybody. I want to go somewhere I've never been. Went to Boston, met my husband like 3 months after I moved there. We didn't get married 3 months after I moved there, but yeah, I met him
Uh-huh.
right after I moved there. And stayed there for a while. And I got into Emerson for my MFA. I got into the New
Mhm.
School in New York, all these other places. But by that point, I was sitting in my head, I had looked and I was like, oh, I want to go back to the UK. Like I loved it there.
Mm.
And I said to we weren't married at the time, but I said to my husband, would you go? And he's like, he was able to because he could work remotely. So I was like,
Uh-huh.
sweet. So I applied to the University of Glasgow because they have an MFA program that's similar to ones in the US. They're
Oh,
two
okay.
years. Most master's programs in the UK are only 1 year.
Hmm.
And I knew I wanted to go for longer. I wanted something that was called an MFA, which is not what they're called in the UK normally.
Hmm.
And so I was like, because I knew if I come back, I want people to know that what the degree is, etc. And so yeah, we just went, and we had already been to Scotland, and we loved it and fallen in love, and so
Uh-huh.
we went, and then I came back for a couple of years and accidentally went back and got the doctorate back at the same place I got my master's because I loved it so much and I loved the people and. Uh, yeah, so that's how I ended up there. Now
Uh,
it's like a
I was
second
just
home.
curious
Yeah, and
because
and what?
nowadays there are so many MFA programs,
Oh
to
yeah.
choose from. So I was just curious about that
Well,
one.
and it was funny because when I was doing the doctorate there initially, I was like, oh, I wonder if I'm gonna like. I didn't know if I was gonna focus on just the US or like would I look at the UK, and
Hmm.
it's so different in the UK how things are handled, or not so different, but different enough. And I was in Glasgow and I'd have to travel to the US to like go do
Yeah.
my research. So that was like okay, but it's fine. Yeah.
So where we have about 10 minutes left.
Mhm.
Where does this take you? I mean, well, two questions. One,
Mm.
is there anything that I haven't asked you
Mm.
about the work that you've done or your work as a writer that you think would be really important to add?
Hmm. Gosh, that's a hard question to ask. I mean, I feel
I
like you
know,
have
I just,
some great questions, or hard question to answer. I don't know, not necessarily. I think, um, nothing's coming to mind off the top of my head
okay,
because I could, talk about all kinds of different manner of
right.
things. So yeah.
Some people
Um,
have a particular, like, oh, but I really wanted to
oh
mention.
yeah.
Yeah,
No, I could talk about all of it
okay.
in different ways. Did you ask the other part of the question or was that
No,
no,
the next
second?
question, because I was going to move
Mhm.
ahead, is having done this project and
Mhm.
having had it open out so much for you, what's your next project? Can you talk about your
Yes,
next
I will
project?
talk
And
about my next project and putting it
yeah,
out there. Yeah, so the last two chapters of this book, one focuses on medical respite primarily, which is, I mentioned that before, but to define it, medical respite units are places for people who are unhoused to go if they're not sick enough to be in the hospital or stay in the hospital, but they're too sick to be on the streets.
mm,
So you have a broken leg, or you're going through chemo or something where
right.
you need a safe place to recoup. Uh, that being said, they're not ubiquitous. It's not like everywhere you go they exist. But they have popped up around the country as a stopgap, as a way to kind of fill this gap. There's one in Boston that's well known. It's one of the bigger ones. It's called Boston Healthcare for the Homeless program. They do all kinds of things, but they big part of that is the medical respite. So that chapter focuses on kind of people who end up there because at some
Right.
point, I start with the death because I entered into it through the death. I came to the cemeteries and death care first, but I started thinking, I was like, well, I can't just talk about the death in this bubble because you don't just end up in a potter's field by accident. Like,
Right.
there's a trajectory of potential injustices that have happened or inaccessibility that's happened along the way that's led to a point where you can't afford to be buried.
Yeah.
And so I want to look beyond that. So I started looking at sort of end of life care and also just a little bit of healthcare in general. Because if I went too far in that direction, it'd be a much larger book.
Oof.
Um,
Yeah.
I stopped kind of at the foot care clinic
Hmm.
as where I stop with that. But then yeah, so I get into the dying aspect, and so it's the medical respite, but also the hospice. So there's hospice for unhoused people, and again, they are not all over the place. They're varying in size and scope. There's one in Salt Lake City that can house. I think they've got. I always forget the exact number, but they've got like 50 beds for hospice and another 50 or 60 for
Wow.
medical respite. There's smaller ones like in Madison, Wisconsin, there's one that they have 4 beds, and that's for the whole state. Same in
Wow.
Denver, they have one that has 3 beds, Rocky Mountain Refuge. Just spoke with the man today. Uh, they only have 3 beds for the entire state, and they're constantly running out of funding and having to shut down temporarily. So they're about a month out from shutting down again until they can get more funding. So they're all, and there's one in Sacramento, not far from me, that's just opened up. Took them 10 years to get open because there was so much NIMBYism. They really struggled to get funding and stuff. So anyway, long story. The point is that for the next project I want to work on, looking primarily at medical respite and hospice for people experiencing homelessness. And I really want it to be narrative driven, speaking to patients and residents and also the staff and the caregivers, the people that go into this work, the people that open these
Yeah.
places, and just really kind of hyper focus on that because they're doing really hard, really important, necessary work. And I think people have no idea that these exist. And
Right.
again, there aren't that many of them, and they struggle a lot of times. So just really bringing some awareness around and kind of doing this deep dive into that particular area is where I want to focus next.
And as a writer, you've talked about your process
Mhm.
and sort of the stopping and the starting and the forward and the back and the jumping over here. Do you feel like out of writing the first book, hey honey, my cat, um, that you now have a sense more of how to write the second one?
Oh yeah.
Okay,
Yeah. I
good.
mean, the last chapter on hospice in this book, I wrote after I signed with a publisher. I had
Mm-hmm.
this kind of dream of doing that chapter and looking, I really wanted to spend some time on hospice for unhoused people. But when I signed it, I said to my editor, I was like, would it be okay if I wrote one more chapter? And
Mm-hmm.
she's like, yeah, of course. She was super cool with that. But she was like, if you want it to be out by, this was in 20, like it was like May of 2024. She said, if you want to be out for fall of 25, I just need it by the fall of this year. So I gave myself a deadline of like August. I need to have this done.
Uh-huh.
And, the deaths of disparity chapter in this book probably took me the whole of the doctorate to write because I kept, and then after that, as I revised it like 100 times, and then I sent it to the Massachusetts Review and they revised it further. Um, I I banged that chapter out in about 2 months because I was so
Uh-huh.
focused. And at that point, I've like, I now one, I know how to do this on this bigger scale than just that essay level, but also like having that specific topic in mind. Unlike this book, which is a bit broader and kind of comes from all these different angles and layers, I'm like this, it has a much narrower focus and should be much, not, I'm gonna knock on all the wood, faster and easier to write. We'll see. Yeah.
Well, I was thinking, I think you made a sort of a kind of side comment about not wanting to get into the healthcare system and I thought, good luck. But
Right. And it's well, and I think yeah, and so it's like having to talk about that some, but I didn't want to go so far back in the trajectory of
yeah,
because you could
don't.
there's too much. There's way too much there
And
you
it's
could
a
talk about.
swamp, yeah.
Oh yeah.
And I just, again, I think, I mean, the book itself is, I think, inspiring, if
Okay.
also upsetting.
Mm.
But as a writer, just what you've talked about in terms of taking on something. I mean, what stands out to me is taking on something that just grabbed you.
Mm-hmm.
And even though it was something that somebody could say, well, that's pretty depressing, you know, it grabbed you and you found mentors.
Right.
That's partly why I asked the UK question, was
Yeah.
because you've got to find people who will read what you want to write. And if it's a topic that might not be popular,
Right.
you have to find people who are going to support you. And
Absolutely.
that it can often be the beauty of an MFA program.
Absolutely.
And they can, you know, may help you also at other steps.
Mhm.
But so that's one thing, sort of the permission, the freedom to just say, but that fascinates me. I can't
Yeah.
stop thinking about it. And then also just how complicated the process is. You have to be kind of willing to go with it,
Yeah.
you know, and lay
Yeah.
paper all over the floor and hope your cats don't run all over it, you
I
know,
know.
or
I
find
know.
yourself a really big wall or something.
Yeah.
But that kind of that dedication, but just the way you said you're a planner, but you obviously also know how to kind of just follow what you have
Yeah.
to do and do it.
That's it. And I tell students that all the time. I was like, you just have to see where the writing takes you.
Yeah.
And sometimes. And right now, I'm planning for book two research, and I'm lining up traveling here and doing this and doing that. But who knows what's gonna come of that? And every time I talk to somebody, if something else crops up,
Yeah.
and I just grab at it and potentially you sometimes just have to say yes to those opportunities because you don't know what stories they're gonna lead you to.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, I think it's like having a plan, but understanding that you're very likely or just absolutely 100% going to deviate that from that and
Right.
probably 100 times over.
Right. And that's okay.
And that's okay. You just
Yeah.
keep making mini plans. If you're a planner, you just keep making mini plans and you
That's
keep
right.
changing them, and that's fine. And that's how self-soothe as you're going through and it's not going to plan.
Well, I've been rereading Annie Lamott
Mhm.
and, you know, The Bird by Bird,
Yeah,
and she quotes, I forget which writer it is, said basically writing is like driving in the fog with your headlights. You know, you just go the where right in front to where the headlights are, and then you go to the next one and the next one.
that's it.
Um, we're about out of time, and I have a couple of closing remarks. Is there anything else, again, that you want to add? This has been wonderful, and I
No,
could go
thank
on
you.
all night long,
I
but
know. Thank you so much. No, I really appreciate you, Marjorie, and the Writers Room for hosting and giving me the space to talk about this. And yeah, no, thank you. I really appreciate it.
well, I don't think your website is in the chat, but
Well,
can you do that?
I can throw that in. Yeah.
Yeah.
Give me 1 second. I don't know. Um, I don't
Oh, wonderful. Because I really want to sort of keep, you know, this book is Too Poor to Die, and it really is fabulous. And again, it's so all encompassing with I really appreciated, you know, not only the discussion of your subject matter, but the subject of the essay. You know, so anybody who's listening, who's a writer or, you know, looks at this another time on the website, I think will really value that sense of guidance about, well, what is an essay, you know, and the freedom that you get with it.
know.
So if nothing else, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up and thank you. And yeah, so you can take yourself off or you can stay on either way.
I'll stay till the bitter end.
Anyway, so thank you for your thoughts on the essay and on writing and on your topic. And I want to thank everybody who joined us for this. Again, we have an audience tonight, then we always get people looking at the recording. So it's on the website and it'll be up not tomorrow, but probably, you know, in a fairly short period of time. And special thanks to Leslie Ostro, who is the Writers Room Program Director and also our technology maven, without which I would have a nervous breakdown, for her help. And it is programmed. So other things, we will have another interview this spring. We haven't quite nailed down who that's going to be, but keep an eye on both the website and also the Facebook and Instagram pages. And then you can look there also for announcements for the Reading from the Room, for online and in-person writing groups, and any other Writers' Room events. So thank you and good night. Thank you again, Amy. Thank you, everybody, and have a great rest of the evening. Good night.